Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a story. Now, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. All right, let's step back in time to the year 1873 and uncover the haunting mystery of Emma Richter, the girl science could never explain. Asterisk, asterisk. The winter of 1873 settled over the small town of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with the kind of sharp air that carried the smell of wood smoke and the sound of wagon wheels creaking against frozen dirt. Families huddled inside their narrow clapboard homes, lamps glowing soft in the windows, while outside, the bare branches of sycamore trees clawed at a gray sky. Lancaster was a quiet place, a town where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled quicker than the mail coach, and where the old ways of belief still walked alongside the new promises of science. It was a town balanced between tradition and progress, a place where railroads cut through farmland, but where most men still trusted prayer more than medicine. It was in this world that a girl named Emma Richter came of age. She was 15 years old that winter, with pale blue eyes that often seemed too old for her young face, and a quietness about her that unsettled neighbors who expected girls to be lively and busy. Emma's father, Heinrich, was a German immigrant who worked in a tannery on the edge of town. He was a stern man, broad-shouldered and serious, his hands stained dark from years of labor. Her mother, Margaret, was softer, with the kind of tired smile that revealed a woman who had carried more children than she buried. Emma was their eldest surviving daughter, and from her earliest years she carried with her a strangeness the town whispered about in private. At first, it was dismissed as childish oddity. Emma had a way of knowing things she should not know. A neighbor's cow would fall ill, and before anyone could see the signs, Emma would tell her mother not to buy milk there. A fire broke out in a barn one autumn, and Emma had warned of smoke the night before. Such coincidences, people said. Children were fanciful. Children said strange things all the time. But as she grew, the things she knew became harder to explain away. Her father, a practical man who valued hard work and no nonsense, grew uneasy. Her mother prayed over her at night, whispering old German hymns, as if faith could push back whatever lived inside her child. By 1873, her strangeness had become impossible to ignore. Emma would enter spells, sudden and uninvited, where her body grew stiff and her voice changed. She would speak in languages she had never been taught, German phrases too old even for her immigrant father to fully understand, or words that sounded like no language anyone had ever heard. Sometimes she would mutter in English, speaking about events that had not yet come to pass. A man was thrown from his horse on the road to Philadelphia, just a week after Emma described it. A child died of fever in a farmhouse, just as Emma had whispered about. Whispers followed her everywhere. Neighbors avoided her gaze in the marketplace, yet could not stop themselves from retelling the strange stories. Some called her touched by God, others by the devil. In a town where faith was strong and science was still struggling to win trust, there was no easy place for a girl like Emma Richter. Her father forbade her to speak of these things. He struck the table hard one evening, shouting that she must hold her tongue, that no good could come of a girl who frightened people with strange talk. Her mother wept quietly, torn between fear and love. Emma herself seemed caught in between. She never asked for the visions, never sought to be different, but they came unbidden, leaving her trembling, her pale hands clutching at her dress, as if she might hold herself to the earth through sheer will. Then came the winter night that turned whispers into something darker. Snow lay thick over Lancaster, and the church bells were muffled under the weight of the storm. Emma had been feverish that day, her skin clammy, though no fire burned in her body. Her parents thought it a winter illness, But when the fever broke suddenly near midnight, Emma sat upright in bed, eyes wide, her face ghost pale in the lamplight. In a voice that was not her own, she began to speak. Her words poured out with such force that her mother dropped the candle in terror. She spoke of death that would come to the town, of a sickness in the water that would take children first, then mothers, then fathers. She cried out names, some known to her, others not. She spoke of coffins, lined up along the churchyard. By morning, the story had spread. Lancaster was a place where word traveled faster than reason. By the end of the week, half the town believed Emma was a prophet, while the other half believed she was cursed. The pastor preached against superstition, urging the people to put their faith in God, not the strange mutterings of a sickly girl. Yet when, weeks later, a fever did spread through the town, carrying off children and leaving families in grief, the people remembered Emma's warning. Fear turned sharper then, no longer curiosity, but dread. It was around this time that science took an interest. Dr. Jonathan Hensley, a physician with ties to the new medical college in Philadelphia, heard the rumors. He had studied under men who believed that all mysteries had an explanation, that superstition was nothing but ignorance, waiting to be corrected. He came to Lancaster not as a believer, but as a skeptic, eager to prove that Emma Richter was no prophet, but rather a case study of hysteria, epilepsy, or some other disorder of the mind. When he first saw Emma, seated quietly in her family's dim parlor, he was struck not by madness, but by the stillness in her. She did not thrash or wail like the patients he had seen in asylums. Instead, she sat with folded hands, eyes steady, as though she were waiting for something only she could hear. Her answers to his questions were soft and polite, though at times she would pause and look past him, as if listening to a voice just beyond his reach. Hensley kept notes, filling pages with observations, sketches, and theories. He wrote that she displayed symptoms of what he called trance states, where her pulse slowed and her awareness seemed suspended. He noted her sudden bursts of knowledge, her descriptions of distant events. He dismissed some as coincidence, others as tricks of memory. Yet there were moments he could not explain, moments when Emma spoke of things that would later prove true. He could not fit her into the neat boxes of medicine he had been taught. The town grew divided. Some saw Hensley's presence as validation that Emma was important, worth study, perhaps even touched by something divine. Others resented the attention, fearing Lancaster would be marked as a place of witchcraft or madness. Families who had lost children to fever whispered that Emma had cursed them. Stones were thrown at the Richter home one night, shattering a window. Her father stood in the doorway with a rifle, daring anyone to cross the threshold. Emma herself grew more withdrawn. The more people pressed upon her, the quieter she became. She confessed to her mother once, in a voice so small it nearly broke Margaret's heart, that she did not understand why these things happened to her. "I only want to be like the others," she whispered. But she was not like the others, and deep down, she knew it. What happened in the spring of 1873 would ensure she never would be. It began on a Sunday morning, as the bells called the town to church. Emma was walking with her mother when she collapsed. Suddenly in the road, her body stiff, her eyes rolled back. She began to convulse, her hands clawing at the air. A crowd gathered quickly, some shouting for help, others murmuring prayers. When her voice broke forth, shrill and otherworldly, the townsfolk recoiled. She spoke of fire, of rivers running, read of a darkness that would cover Lancaster before the year was done. Hensley rushed to her side, urging the crowd to step back, insisting it was a medical seizure. But the people saw something else. They saw a girl possessed, a girl who carried inside her something no man of science could control. And in that moment, Emma Richter became not just a curiosity, but a mystery that shook the foundations of both faith and reason. The spring of 1873 stretched long in Lancaster, wet and restless. The thawing ground turned the roads into rivers of mud, and wagons splashed brown water against the legs of women who carried baskets of bread and eggs to market. The town was alive with change, yet underneath it all was a heaviness, a fear that clung to every whispered story about Emma Richter. Her collapse on the church road had not been forgotten. People remembered how her voice had risen above the bells, clear and sharp, speaking of fire and shadow. For many, that moment had drawn a line. She was no longer just a peculiar girl. She was something to fear. Her father tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. Heinrich worked longer hours at the tannery, his hands raw from the sting of chemicals, as though labor could beat back the shame and unease that hung over his household. But the world outside their small clapboard home had shifted. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. Children who once played with Emma's younger siblings were now called inside by cautious mothers. At night, when the lamps were blown out, Margaret Richter would sit awake, listening to the soft breathing of her children, wondering if the townsfolk were right, if something unholy had taken root in her eldest child. Yet within Emma herself there was no malice, only sorrow. She grew pale and thinner as the weeks passed, her appetite fading. She would sit by the window for hours, her eyes drifting across the fields, as though she were waiting for something distant and unseen. Sometimes she would hum, a low tune without words, the kind of sound that made her mother's skin prickle, because it was not a melody Margaret recognized from any hymn or folk song. Other times she would startle suddenly, as if she had heard someone call her name, though no one else in the room had spoken. Dr. Hensley returned often, notebook always in hand, curiosity driving him more than compassion. He performed small examinations, testing her reflexes, studying her pulse, asking her questions about what she saw and felt. At times Emma answered plainly, her voice soft and hesitant. At other times she slipped into that strange stillness, her gaze unfocused, her words spilling forth like water from a spring. Hensley recorded it all, though privately he struggled. He wanted so desperately to fit her into the framework of science, to declare her a case of hysteria or epilepsy, but each visit left him unsettled. There were things she said that should not have been possible. One evening in May, as thunderclouds gathered over the horizon, Hensley asked her what she saw when she fell into her trances. Emma sat quiet for a long moment before her eyes filled with tears. "I see what is coming," she whispered. "I see what will be. I don't want to, but I can't stop it." She trembled, her voice breaking. "Sometimes it's fire, sometimes sickness. Sometimes I see faces I know lying still in the ground. I don't want it. I just want to be left in peace." Hensley closed his notebook, shaken by the rawness of her confession. He wrote later in his journal that night that she was not mad in the way the world called madness. Rather, she seemed burdened by something she could not carry. He admitted, reluctantly, that science had no neat explanation for her. The people of Lancaster did not share his patience. To them, Emma was a storm cloud hanging over their town. When the tannery caught fire in June, men swore it was her curse. When a boy drowned in the Conestoga River, whispers blamed her. Each tragedy, no matter how ordinary, found its way to her doorstep. The Richter family bore the weight of suspicion, their names spoken in taverns and church, pews with equal dread. Margaret clung to her daughter, urging her to pray harder, to keep her head down, to trust in God's mercy. Heinrich grew angrier, striking the table and declaring he would not have his family torn apart by gossip. But even his stubborn strength could not hold back the tide. The breaking point came on a hot July evening when a traveling revival preacher came to Lancaster. His name was Reverend Silas Walker, a tall, gaunt man with fiery eyes and a voice that seemed to shake the air itself. He drew great crowds beneath. A canvas tent pitched on the edge of town, preaching of sin and salvation, of demons walking among men, and of the need to cast out evil wherever it was found. His words carried power, stirring fear into fire, that it did not take long for Emma Richter's name to reach his ears. By the third night of preaching, Walker thundered from the pulpit about a child of Lancaster who bore signs of possession, a girl through whom Satan himself whispered. His followers, whipped into frenzy, nodded and wept and shouted amen. By morning, word spread that Reverend Walker would confront the girl to test her spirit and drive out whatever darkness dwelled within her. Emma's father forbade it. He barred the door, declaring that no wandering preacher would humiliate his family. But Lancaster was no longer his alone. Crowds gathered outside the Richter home, torches in hand, demanding that Emma be brought forth. Fear and faith had blended into something dangerous. Her mother wept, pleading with her husband to relent before the mob turned violent. In the end, Heinrich had no choice. Surrounded, he allowed them to take his daughter to the tent. What happened that night would live in whispers for years. Emma was placed before the preacher, pale and trembling, her thin hands clasped in her lap. Reverend Walker stood tall, his voice booming as he commanded her to renounce the devil. At first she was silent, her lips moving in some unheard prayer. Then, as the crowd pressed closer, her body stiffened, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. A voice burst forth from her, deep and unearthly. Speaking words no one recognized, the crowd erupted. Some cried out in terror. Others shouted hallelujah, certain they had witnessed proof of possession. Walker pressed on, laying hands upon her head, demanding the demon depart. Emma convulsed, her body arching, her voice breaking into screams. For an hour it went on, the preacher calling out, the girl writhing, the crowd caught between fear and fascination. At last she collapsed, motionless, her chest rising only with shallow breaths. She survived, but something in her broke that night. When she awoke, her voice was hoarse, her eyes dim, as though she had been hollowed out. She no longer spoke of visions. She no longer warned of sickness or fire. Instead, she sat quietly, hands folded, a ghost of the girl she had been. The crowd declared victory. The demon had been cast out, they said. Reverend Walker left Lancaster a hero. But those who lived closest to the Richter family knew better. Emma was not healed. She was simply silenced. Dr. Hensley visited her weeks later, finding her pale and thin, her spirit subdued. She answered his questions with a nod or a single word, no longer slipping into trances, no longer speaking with voices not her own. He wrote in his journal that it was not deliverance, but exhaustion. She had been broken by the weight of fear and the violence of faith. And yet, late that summer, whispers began again. A farmer swore he saw her standing at the edge of his field at dawn, though she had not left her bed. A woman claimed Emma spoke her name in a dream, warning her not to let her child drink from the well, and days later, sickness struck that same well water. Quiet rumors began to drift through Lancaster once more, soft but persistent. Perhaps the visions had not ended. Perhaps Emma Richter remained what she had always been, a mystery science could not explain and faith could not contain. Autumn came to Lancaster with the smell of apples and the sound of wagon wheels grinding against fallen leaves. The fields turned gold and then bare, smoke curling from chimneys as families prepared for the long winter ahead. But in the Richter household, the season carried no joy. Emma sat often by the hearth, her thin frame wrapped in blankets, her face pale in the firelight. Since that summer night under the revival tent, she had seemed half herself, quieter, more fragile, as if the life had been drawn out of her. Her younger siblings tiptoed around her, unsure if they should treat her as sister or specter. Her mother never stopped watching her, never stopped praying. Margaret Richter carried an ache in her chest, each time she looked upon her eldest daughter, remembering the laughing child Emma had once been, before whispers and trances had stolen her away. She prayed harder than ever, lighting candles, clutching her worn Bible, begging God to spare Emma from whatever burden clung to her soul. Heinrich, too, had changed. Once proud and stubborn, he now carried a weight in his shoulders, a shame he could not shake. He hated the way people looked at him in town, hated the muttered names, witch's father, cursed man. He drank more, his voice louder at night, the table rattling under his fists. Yet even in his anger, he could not bring himself to turn against Emma. She was his child, blood of his blood, though he did not understand her. Dr. Hensley continued his visits, though less frequently. He had been shaken by the revival, appalled at what had been done to the girl in the name of salvation. In his journals, he wrote that he feared Emma's condition had worsened, not improved. He observed her withdrawn state, her reluctance to speak, her frail health. Yet beneath it all, he sensed the same mystery, waiting, silent but not gone. Science still had no answer, and Hensley began to admit, quietly to himself, that perhaps no answer would ever come. But Emma was not as silent as she seemed. Late at night, when the house was dark, she would whisper to her mother in the quiet. Margaret recalled years later, in a letter found folded in a Bible, that Emma told her things she could not bear to repeat to others. She spoke of a darkness that lingered over the town, of names of those soon to die, of fires yet to burn. She begged her mother not to tell, not to let the others know, because she feared they would come for her again. Margaret promised to keep her secret, holding her trembling daughter close, torn between the fear of what she said and the fear of what others might do to her if they knew. In October, a tragedy struck Lancaster that reignited whispers. A barn on the edge of town caught fire in the night. Flames roared high, devouring timber and hay, sending sparks into the sky. 2 men perished inside, trapped beneath the falling beams. By morning, the fire was the only talk of the town. And soon enough, Emma's name was on every tongue again. For it was said, quietly at first, then with conviction, that Emma had whispered of fire days before. A neighbor claimed he overheard her at the well, murmuring to herself about smoke and burning. Another swore she had spoken the names of the very men who died. The Richter family was once again under the weight of suspicion. Stones were thrown at their house. Curses shouted from the road. A dead chicken was left on their doorstep, its neck twisted, a cruel warning. Heinrich raged, storming into the tavern to strike any man who dared speak against his daughter. Margaret wept more openly now, torn between faith and despair. And Emma, caught in the storm of fear and fury, only withdrew further into herself, her eyes haunted, her voice barely more than a whisper. Yet the truth was that Emma's visions had not ceased. They had only grown sharper, more relentless. She no longer fought them. She no longer tried to hide them. Instead, they came to her like a tide, unbidden, unstoppable. Sometimes they left her shaking, clutching at her dress, her breath shallow. Other times they left her hollow, staring into the distance as if the world around her no longer mattered. She was drifting further and further from the life of a girl, further from the simplicity of childhood, into something no one could understand. One evening in November, as cold winds rattled the shutters, she startled her family at supper. Without warning, she dropped her spoon, her eyes unfocused. Her voice, quiet but firm, said, "The river will take him." Heinrich froze, staring at her. "Who?" he demanded. Emma blinked, as if waking from a dream, and looked at her father with sorrow. "You will see," she whispered. A week later, a man named Peter Keller was swept beneath the icy current of the Conestoga River. His body was pulled out downstream, stiff and lifeless. And once again, Emma's words became the story of the town. By now, even those who had once dismissed her as hysterical began to avoid her name. She was not to be spoken of casually, for fear that her words might bring ruin. Some whispered she was cursed. Others whispered she was chosen, touched by God in a way that mortals could not understand. The truth was simpler and sadder. Emma was a girl, caught between belief and disbelief, carrying a weight she had never asked for. As winter crept closer, snow dusting the rooftops and freezing the wells, Emma grew weaker. She coughed often, her breath rattling. The doctor prescribed tonics, but nothing helped. Her mother sat by her bed, stroking her hair, whispering prayers. Her father stood in the doorway, helpless, the firelight flickering across his stern, broken face, and still, even in her weakness, the visions came. One night she woke screaming, crying out that the earth was opening, that coffins lined the churchyard, that names she knew and names she didn't were being called into the dark. Her cries chilled her family to the bone, and though they tried to soothe her, to convince her it was only a dream deep down, each of them feared. She spoke the truth. By Christmas of 1873, Lancaster no longer spoke openly of Emma Richter, but in their homes, in the quiet moments by the fire, people whispered still. They whispered of a girl science could not explain, a girl who seemed to see death before it came, a girl who carried both fear and sorrow wherever she walked. She had become a figure of both fascination and dread, a living reminder that there were things in this world that neither prayer nor science could touch. The winter of 1873 pressed down hard on Lancaster, the kind of winter that froze breath in the air and cracked the boards of barns. The Conestoga River lay still under ice, and the streets emptied except for wagons hauling coal. Families huddled. Indoors, the world outside dim under clouds. It was in this silence, in this long stretch of bitter cold, that Emma Richter's final days unfolded. Her illness grew worse as the year turned. She coughed at night, her body trembling with each fit, her face pale as linen. The doctor called it a wasting sickness, the sort that took hold of young women and left them weaker each week until there was nothing left. He recommended rest, broths, and faith, but no medicine dulled the edge of her decline. Emma was slipping away, piece by piece, as if her visions were burning her life out from within. Yet even in her weakness, the mystery endured. On nights when the fever raged and sweat soaked her sheets, she would speak words that froze her mother's heart. She whispered of names that would be read at funerals, of storms that would topple barns, of faces her family had not yet seen. Among the dead, she spoke with eyes closed, her lips trembling, her voice so faint it was sometimes mistaken for the crackle of the fire. Her mother, Margaret, sat beside her always, torn between the wish to silence her child and the ache to go. Bear witness. She wrote down some of the things Emma said in a small journal, though she never showed it to anyone. Her father, Heinrich, remained restless, pacing the house, torn between anger and helplessness. He could not strike at this unseen enemy, could not silence the whispers that followed their family through the town. He prayed less, drank more, his hands shaking as he sat by the fire. Once, when Emma spoke in her fever of coffins lining the churchyard, Heinrich shouted at her to stop, his voice breaking with tears. But Emma only looked at him, sorrowful, and whispered, "I cannot." By February of 1874, Emma could no longer rise from her bed. Her hair lay damp against her forehead, her breath shallow. The pastor visited once, offering prayers, his hands trembling as he placed them on her brow. He had been among those who doubted her, who called her strange words foolishness. But as he stood in her room, he admitted quietly to her mother that he had no answers. He prayed for her soul and for the family, but his eyes betrayed fear. Doctor Hensley came once more, his notebook closed now, his face lined with quiet grief. He had come to Lancaster years earlier, eager to explain her away, eager to prove that science could solve even the darkest mysteries. But as he looked upon Emma Richter, fading before him, he wrote in his journal that he had failed. She was no case study. She was no experiment. She was something beyond his understanding, and her death would carry away the secrets he could not unlock. On a gray morning in March, as snow began to melt into muddy rivers, Emma stirred in her bed for the last time. Her mother held her hand, her father standing stiff at the foot of the bed. Emma's lips moved, though her voice was thin as wind. Her mother leaned close to hear. "It is so quiet," Emma whispered, "so quiet. But I am not afraid." She closed her eyes then, and her breath slowed, and before noon the house was still. The town buried her in the churchyard, beneath a small stone carved with her name and the year of her death. The ground was still hard with frost, and the men swung their shovels heavy, their breaths clouding the air. The pastor spoke of suffering, of mysteries known only to God. Her mother wept into her shawl, her father's face a mask of stone. Few neighbors came. Many stayed home, fearful still of the girl who had frightened them in life. But Emma did not leave Lancaster with her death. She remained in whispers, in the quiet talk of townsfolk who could not shake the memory of her pale face, her strange words, her eyes that seemed to see too far. Children grew up hearing her story at their mother's knee, warned not to speak of visions, not to tempt fate. Farmers still muttered her name when fire struck or sickness spread. Some said her ghost lingered in the churchyard, watching silently from the shadows. Others said she appeared in dreams, her warnings as sharp as ever. For Dr. Hensley, her death left a mark he carried to his own grave. In his private writings, found years later, he confessed that Emma Richter had changed him. She had shown him that science, for all its promise, could not yet explain the deepest mysteries of the human soul. He wrote that he did not know if she had been blessed or cursed, but he knew she had borne a burden no child should carry. He ended one entry with words that would echo long after. Emma Richter was a question I could never answer. And so, the story of Emma Richter became part of Lancaster's quiet history, half forgotten, half feared, woven into the fabric of old Pennsylvania tales. She was not a prophet, not a witch, not a patient. She was a girl who carried visions that no one wanted, who bore the weight of fear and belief, who slipped away before her life had truly begun. Her grave still rests beneath the sycamores of the old churchyard, the stone weathered, the letters faint. Most who pass by do not know her name, but those who pause, those who listen to the whispers of history, may feel it still. The mystery of a girl science could not explain, and faith could not contain.